Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Welcome to this webinar on the tips for the implementation of the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines and the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. So before we begin, I'd like to start off with some housekeeping rules. So first, please use the chat box if you have any questions. We will be having a dedicated Q&A session at the end, but please do not wait until then. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat box. Second, please answer our questionnaire form that we will be putting in the chat box later on. My colleague Wenbin Zhang will be active in the chat, providing you with useful links, and he will be also putting a link for the questionnaire form. So we would really appreciate to receive your feedback on our webinars, so please make sure to answer the questionnaire before you leave. Third, the presentations and later the recordings are uploaded here. My colleague Wenbin will be uploading the link on the chat so that you can access it. The two presentations for the guidelines are already there, and as I mentioned, the recordings will be put up there later. And we also have it, we will also put it on our YouTube channel as well. And last but not least, please use the hashtag access to space for all, SDM guidelines, LTS guidelines, all of the stuff that you can see here to help us promote this webinar. So today's agenda looks like this. For the various application forms for the programs under the Access to Space for All initiative, which is a capacity building initiative that we have, the office asks applicants to ask about the compliance to the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines and the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. But what are these guidelines? What do you need to know about them, and how can applicants of Access to Space for All fill in the application form to show that they understand these guidelines? The objective of this webinar is really to provide you with the overall information of these two important guidelines, which I would believe will be interesting to a broader audience. And then we will be giving more tips on how to fill in the application form of the different programs under the Access to Space for All initiative, which will be of specific interest to Access to Space for All applicants. And at the end, we will be having a Q&A session. So maybe there are people who are not exactly trying to apply to the Access to Space for All initiative programs, but we will be giving you a broad overview of the different two guidelines and the different activities that are done in the office. So please stay until the end and ask us any questions if you have any. With that, I will end my intro and I will get into the actual details of this webinar. So I would like to introduce my colleague, Ms. Aigo Desenova, who is working for the Committee, Policy and Legal Affairs section of UNOOSA. So I will give the floor to you now, Aigo.
Okay, thank you very much, Hazuki-san. In my presentation, I will provide information about the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. But before that, it would make sense to tell you a bit more about the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which we commonly abbreviate as COPAS. COPAS, as you may know, is a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it was set up by the General Assembly in 1959 to govern the exploration and use of space for the benefit of all humanity, for peace, for security, for development. The committee was tasked with reviewing international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space, studying space-related activities that could be undertaken by the United Nations, encouraging space research programs, and studying legal problems arising from the exploration of outer space. The committee has two subsidiary bodies, STC, or the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, and LSC, the Legal Subcommittee. Both of the subcommittees were established in 1961. Under each of the subcommittee, we have a number of working groups established to address specific areas. So under the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, STC, we currently have 4 working groups: the Working Group on the Whole, Working Group on the Use of Nuclear Power Sources in Outer Space, Working Group on Space and Global Health, Working Group on the Long-Term Sustainability of Outer Space Activities. We currently have 3 working groups under the Legal Subcommittee. So the topic of space debris was first included under the agenda of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee as early as in 1994. Subcommittee had a work plan spanning from 1996 to 1998, focusing on developing technical report on space debris, and the technical report was adopted in 1999. Later on, a couple of years later, in 2004, a special working group, STC working group on space debris, was set up, and that working group was working on the adoption of the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines of the committee, COPAS Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines. The guidelines were adopted in 2007. The other subcommittee of COPAS, the legal subcommittee, considers legal aspects of space debris. Here, I would like to bring to you some terminology that is used with regard to space debris when we are talking about space debris. The two main concepts are space debris mitigation and remediation. So I'm wondering if the audience knows the difference between mitigation and remediation. In simple words, mitigation is about prevention. What should be done now to make sure that no debris is created in the future? So if you are planning to launch a satellite, what do you need to know already now at the stage of design, at the stage of planning, so that you avoid creating space debris in the future? Remediation, on the other hand, is dealing with the current debris pollution. So there are many unfunctional objects in orbit. What can you do to remove them? Do you move them from orbit, or do you go on orbit and fix a satellite, or do you refuel a satellite? Do you use a net or harpoon to catch a satellite? So there are tons of ideas like that, how to decrease the pollution that already exists. That's where we use the term remediation. Mitigation, prevention, and remediation is dealing with the current problems. So, Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines at the committee. It started in 2003 when the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, or IADC, this is a specialized body consisting of space agencies looking specifically at the problem of space debris, when IADC presented its proposals on space debris mitigations to STC. The next year, STC working group on space debris was established, and the main task was development of the guidelines. The working group was chaired by Italy. And to tell you a bit about the process, when the guidelines were developed in 2007, they were first adopted by the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. Later that year, in June, they were endorsed by the committee, by COPAS, at its annual session. And at the end of the year, the guidelines were endorsed by the General Assembly in its resolution. What the guidelines are about? There are 7 specific guidelines. The guidelines are written in a very simple language, and they are very self-explanatory. Guideline 1 is asking operators to limit debris released during normal operations. It can be sensor covers, it can be different separation mechanisms. Whenever you are planning your mission, these guidelines is telling you, please try to see if you can limit what is released during the operation. Try to launch what is useful, what is necessary. Guidelines number 2 asks you to minimize potential breakups during the operation phases. Guidelines number 3 asks you to look at the probability of accidental collision, how you avoid other objects in orbit. Guideline 4 asks to avoid intentional distractions and other harmful activities that can lead to the destruction of space objects. Guideline 5 looks at the stored energy, and asks you to minimize potential post-mission breakups resulting from stored energy. If you have any residual propellants, any compressed fuels, any electrical storage devices, try already at the planning and design stage to see what can be done to make sure that the energy sources are emptied. And guidelines 6 and 7 are guiding you to avoid leaving the spacecraft after its operations in LEO, low Earth orbits, or geosynchronous Earth orbits. Two more sources of information that I would like to share with you today. First is a compilation of documents on research of space debris. So these documents are issued in all official languages of the United Nations, and they contain submissions from states and organizations on research in this field. So you have a presentation available to you, you have a link. Following that link would lead you to the page where we post all the documents which contain submissions from countries and organizations. The second compilation that I would like to share with you is a compendium of space debris mitigation standards. I basically encourage you to visit this webpage. It contains an overview of all national mechanisms. If there is any legislation at the national level by countries to address space debris, that is included in part 1. There are also compilation of international mechanisms, and as I said, it contains the COPAS guidelines, it contains the full text of IADC guidelines, ITU recommendations, etc. Standards and technical reports of ISO, or description of it, on that webpage. And as I mentioned earlier, IADC guidelines have formed the basis for the COPAS guidelines. On the next slide, I don't think you have this slide in your presentation, but I decided to insert it last minute to show you the difference between COPAS guidelines and IADC guidelines. So this is one guideline that is talking about the post-mission disposal, how to avoid geosynchronous region after the mission is over. The guideline on top is the simple language from the COPAS guideline, which tells you that you have to limit the long-term interference with the geosynchronous Earth orbit after the end of the mission. The guideline at the bottom of the slide is from IADC guidelines. So you would see that although the content is the same, the text has a little bit more of technical language and is written with more technical details. And as I said earlier, all of that are available from the webpage of the Compendium on Space Debris Mitigation Standards. So I will move to the last slide of my presentation. And here on this slide, I have inserted the language from the General Assembly Omnibus resolutions on international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. Here you would see the language in which the General Assembly expresses its deep concern about the fragility of space environment, and in particular the impact of space debris. The General Assembly invites states to implement the space debris mitigation guidelines of the committee and considers that it's essential that states pay more attention to the problem of collision with space objects, and that states continue research on this question, develop improved technology for monitoring of space debris, and compile and disseminate data on space debris wherever possible, and also agrees that international cooperation is needed to expand appropriate and affordable strategies to minimize the impact of space debris on future space missions. So this is the language of General Assembly Omnibus resolutions as related to the topic of space debris. With this, I am reaching the end of my presentation, but also the end of the 15-minute slot. Over to you, Hazuki.
Thank you so much, Aigo, for this really organized and detailed presentation. I think we were able to learn about the overview of course, COPAS, the committee, and the guidelines. So thank you very much. If you have any questions to IGOL and about the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, please stick until the end where we will have our Q&A. Next, I'd like to introduce our colleague also from the section on the Committee Policy and Legal Affairs, which is Ms. Tanya Kusin. She will be explaining about the LTS guidelines. I'll hand it over to you, Tanya.
Perfect, thank you. I just want to check that you can now see my presentation. I should be sharing.
Yeah, we see it perfectly and we hear you perfectly.
Thank you so much. So yeah, a good day to everyone. It really is a pleasure to be with you. As mentioned, my name is Tanya Koysen, and my main portfolio for the last years has been working on the topic of space sustainability, more specifically on the political and policy work that's been going on at the intergovernmental level to address the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. So that's the topic I will be addressing with you today. In particular, I'm going to tell you about the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, both how and why they were developed, and what kind of guidance they contain. And I'll just quickly apologize that I'm not able to use a video for the presentation. I don't have a webcam where I am, but I don't think it's going to be a big hindrance because you can see the slides and they really are the most important thing. I'll also try and not to overlap too much with what IGOL has already told you, although I know there is some interconnections. So what I always like to start with is zooming out a little bit and having everyone think about the big picture of space sustainability. So as you're likely aware, there has been a huge upswing in space activities and in objects being launched into outer space in recent years. The chart you see here, it shows both payloads launched into space annually and the increasing number of countries becoming active in space over time. And you see a large increase taking place starting around the mid-2010s, and then a really huge upswing in the last year. And I'll just note that the data here is for 2020, but the situation for 2021, it really shows very much the same trends. So these major changes, I think they can be seen a couple of ways. Globally, more states and their citizens, they're gaining access to the benefits of space science and space technology. They're joining the space economy, which is undoubtedly positive, and it links closely with development objectives. Oh, pardon me, I went the wrong way. The other side to the coin is that the increasing use of space, it also puts pressure on what is a finite resource. So despite the universe being infinite, the orbits around Earth are becoming increasingly congested. So there's a need to think more about things like space debris, which IGOL just spoke about, potential collisions in outer space, and other risks to space activities. And there really does need to be an agreement so that everyone using space does so in a fair, responsible, and sustainable way. And that's the reason that the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space has been taking the long-term sustainability of outer space activities as a priority topic now for, well, more than 10 years. And maybe I'll just stop here to say that if you hear me using the term LTS in the next few minutes, or if you see it in the slides here, it's an abbreviation for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. And it's used just because the full term can sometimes be a bit of a mouthful. Oh, there we go. Pardon me. So yeah, now I'm going to take a minute to underscore for you what it is we mean when we're talking about LTS. And while we might all intrinsically have some sort of understanding about what sustainability means, states did take the time to work together to agree on the definition that you see here. And I can tell you that it actually took hours and hours to reach consensus on this definition. So to me, the key takeaways are maintaining space activities indefinitely, equal access to the benefits of space, and meeting the needs of the present while also preserving the outer space environment. And these are rather lofty, I guess, and high-level aims, but countries have been working together rather intensively in the past years, developing specific policy guidance on what should be done to reach these aims. And you find the guidance in the guidelines on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. Sorry, having trouble going backwards and forwards with the slides, please excuse that. So as you've already heard, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPAS, it's the UN platform for intergovernmental discussion on the peaceful uses of space. It meets in Vienna several times a year, and it's supported by the Office for Outer Space Affairs. And I think it's important to emphasize in the context of LTS that COPAS is a body that makes decisions by consensus. So all countries have to agree on something in order for it to move ahead. There we go. I think it's also good to highlight that along with the increasing activity we're seeing in outer space, COPAS is also growing. And actually, sort of excitingly, it was just late yesterday that the General Assembly took the final formal action, which brought COPAS membership to a full 100 states members. And here you see all the countries or all the states that belong to COPAS. You see that states come from all geographic regions of the world. You see states with emerging space capabilities, as well as the well-established spacefaring nations. You also see states with very different geopolitical realities. And just so you know, those states that are in blue, those are the ones that just officially joined yesterday evening. And overall, I just wanted to demonstrate for you the diversity of COPAS membership because it takes, what can I say, it adds to the political weight and the legitimacy of the decisions that COPAS makes. So yes, let's get down to what specifically has the committee done on the topic of LTS. It established a working group on the topic in 2010, and that working group was tasked with, amongst other things, developing guidelines to reduce risks to LTS. That working group, it first established 4 working groups on different topics, and those groups, they put forward the first draft guidelines. And then it was the larger working group that further negotiated on the guidelines and worked towards a political consensus. And I think one of the main takeaways from the process is that it really does take a long time to share national experiences and lessons learned in a meaningful way. And it also takes time to have common understanding of different terminology. So the working group, it discovered that it needed more time to complete its work. So in addition to meeting at COPAS, it also held a series of intersessional meetings. And I really think all of this just speaks to the time and energy and effort that states agreed it was worth putting into the topic of LTS. So then after years of work in 2016, the working group reached consensus on a first set of guidelines, but it kept working. And in 2018, it reached consensus on a preamble and then 9 further guidelines. And then in 2019, so a year later, the committee adopted what are now the guidelines for LTS of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. At the same time, it recognized the ongoing importance of the topic, and it established a further working group. The guidelines were also welcomed at the UN General Assembly level, which is important to note because it means they're recognized as important not just by the countries that make up COPAS, but by all the countries that are a part of the UN. So the guidelines that we're speaking about now, they are not legally binding. They are voluntary guidelines. However, given the many hours of engaged debate by international experts that went into their development, and the fact that the guidelines needed to be agreed by consensus, it means that they've gained a strong political legitimacy. The substantive preamble to the guidelines, it sets out the objectives and the scope of the guidelines. It emphasizes that space activities are essential tools for realizing development goals. It explains that the guidelines are relevant to both ongoing and future space activities and to all phases of missions, including launch, operation, and end-of-life disposal. It's also clear that space activities and technologies are developing really quickly. So there are provisions in the preamble for reviewing and revising the guidelines. There we go. The guidelines themselves, they are broken down into 4 sections. Section A covers policy and regulatory frameworks. And it's in that section that you'll find guidance on national regulatory frameworks and supervising national space activities. There's also guidance on registering space objects. So for those who might not already know, UNOOSA, it maintains a register of objects launched into outer space. And this register isn't meant for like real-time tracking of space objects, but it's a political tool and it promotes transparency and confidence building amongst states. Section B of the guidelines is on the safety of space operations, and it's perhaps, I guess, the meatiest section of the guidelines. It provides guidance on things like conjunction assessment and collision avoidance. You have guidelines on space weather. You have a guideline on the uncontrolled re-entry of space objects. You also have a guideline devoted to laser beams passing through outer space. Section C, it speaks to international cooperation, capacity building, and awareness. It emphasizes information sharing, as well as the exchange of experiences, scientific knowledge, technology, and equipment. It also addresses raising general public awareness of the important societal benefits of space activities. Finally, we have Section D, which is shorter with only 2 guidelines, but given the importance of research and development to space sustainability, it warranted its own section. So I think I would just encourage everyone to go and read the full texts of the guidelines on their own, because there's really a lot of good content in them. I'll just warn you beforehand that the language, because it's politically negotiated, it can sometimes be tricky, I would say, maybe a little bit cumbersome, but please don't let that deter you from engaging with the ideas. It's also probably good to note that the language in the guidelines is generally structured along the lines of states and international intergovernmental organizations should do this and that. So if you're coming from academia or perhaps a smaller NGO, it's possible that at first glance, some of the guidelines seem less directly relevant to you. However, I think this is again where I would point to engaging with the key ideas contained in the guidelines. I also think the preamble and the 21 guidelines are really best read together, because it's then that they give a fuller picture of what might be needed to ensure sustainability in the long term. And then in this slide, I just wanted to quickly pull out for you a couple of the guidelines, which I think could be relevant for you in relation to access to space for all applications. And that's not to say that these are the only relevant ones, but guideline B8, for instance, it's on design and operation of space objects, And its key takeaways include increasing trackability of space objects and sharing information on end-of-life disposal. Guideline D1 from the research and development section includes topical ideas such as the reusing and repurposing of space assets. And now that I've talked a little bit about the guidelines, let me quickly touch on the continuing work on the topic. So, as we know, space activities are far from static, so it makes sense that the policy guidance needs to keep pace with the scientific and technical progress. So it's really good that we have this new working group on LTS. It first started to meet earlier this year in 2021, and it's going to look at what states are doing to implement the guidelines. It will study new challenges to LTS, and it will focus on capacity building, in particular for emerging space nations. And I recognize that my time is running short, but let me lastly here just flag for you a project that UNOOSA is undertaking, not in connection with the committee, but on its own. It's been looking at the implementation of the LTS guidelines. So this project has been collecting operational case studies of how the guidelines have been implemented in various jurisdictions. So if you're struggling at all to think about how the guidelines could or should be implemented, I would encourage you to take a look at the case study database that's available on the website that you see here, spacesustainability.unoosa.org. The project also held a series of virtual events earlier in 2021, the recordings of which are available on the same website. And the presentations that you'll find there, they weren't only by space agencies. They were also by members of industry and the private sector, which I think demonstrates the increasing buy-in we're seeing from all sorts of stakeholders on the importance of space sustainability. And yeah, with that, I believe my time is up, and I thank you for your attention, and I wish you all every success with your access to Space for All applications.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for this really detailed presentation. I think we got into the different parts of the guidelines, but also we had the overview, the broad background of what was happening. And as you can see, space sustainability is becoming a really important factor. And that is why in our Access to Space for All applications, we ask you to try to comply with them. So with that, I would like to introduce my colleague Jorge Del Rio Vera, who works for the space application section of our office, and he will be connecting the dots, so connecting the guidelines and the Access to Space for All now. So I will give the floor to Jorge.
Thank you very much, Hazuki. Thank you all for attending. I hope you can see me and see my slides, or maybe you don't see my slides yet.
We see you. The slides are loading. Yeah, they're coming. Okay, perfect.
So what I want to talk to you about is about the Access to Space for All initiative and how the long-term sustainability guidelines and the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines are used inside the Access to Space for All initiative. I would like to recall one graph that my colleague Tanya was putting up. It's about the number of objects that are registered. As you can see, there is a big increase in the last few years. And of course, we are very much concerned about that. Having an initiative as Access to Space for All that also facilitates to institutions in member states to put satellites in orbit. The way Access to Space for All work, for those of you that don't know the initiative, is we provide access to research infrastructure and facilities that would be difficult for countries or institutions in countries to access otherwise. The initiative is supported by a number of partners that is actually growing, and we are very proud of that. We have space agencies as partners, we have research institutions, And we also have private companies supporting us in the initiative. The initiative is structured around 3 tracks that are aiming at delivering a capability to the institutions that are applying to it. Each track has 3 components: a hands-on component, a tools component, and an education component. The hands-on component is the one that is providing the access to those facilities that I was mentioning before. For instance, in the satellite development track, we have an opportunity together with JAXA, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, to be able to deploy a satellite from the International Space Station, 1U CubeSat. We also have under the same track, the satellite development track, another opportunity with a private company, Avio, to be able to deploy a 3U, which is a slightly bigger satellite, launched from a rocket. So considering this, the fact that we are assisting institutions in member states that don't have the capability to actually get acquainted and have experience in space activities, for us it's very important that all the applicants that are applying to these opportunities are observing very much and very well the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines and the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities in a way that is applicable for their application and for the project. As I said, we have 3 components that are gradually going up to the hands-on opportunity, but we have also education, and this webinar is part of the educational component of Access to Space for All, where we are trying to raise awareness and to provide tools and knowledge to actually be able to utilize in the best way possible the hands-on opportunities. Also, we have a tools component, which is basically where we are trying to do is to compile open source tools that can help the applicants to those hands-on opportunities to build a better application form. And we will be talking about that in a couple of minutes. As I said, the activity that we are doing today is part of the education component, where you see in the slide how the education component is structured. We have webinars, we also have fellowships. Some of them are currently open. We have teacher's guide and different materials that are helping to acquire those theoretical knowledge that can be used to use open source tools and then apply to the hands-on opportunities. So please check our webpage because we have a wealth of resources there. And also take into account that of the resources that my 2 colleagues, Tanya and I, were mentioning before, that are also very important in this context. Access to Space for All has enabled 3 countries to have an object launch in the last few years. 3 countries have got to space and launch an object thanks to Access to Space for All opportunities. And you have an example, few examples here. The picture that you have in the center is about Guatemala. Guatemala was able to launch the first satellite thanks to KiboCube, the opportunity that I was mentioning before. And that newspaper clip is actually part of a series that was published in a national newspaper in Guatemala, showcasing the different steps that they were taking for putting up the Guatemalan satellite. A very big achievement that actually encouraged the young generations to be attracted by STEM careers and to understand that it is possible to put a satellite if you have enough willingness to do so. The other case that you have on the upper right, again, is a satellite that has been put in orbit this year. It was the first satellite of Mauritius. And again, it was put in orbit thanks to KiboCube, the opportunity that we have with JAXA. So, of course, when we are putting these applications and we are asking for applications, for us it's very important to be sure that those satellites are not going to cause any problems. And to do that, what we are doing is we are asking actually for compliance to Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines and to the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space. They are guidelines. Of course, they are not mandatory, and they are translated into national law that can be mandatory. But we are asking to understand for the applicants, in case the country doesn't have a particular national law in this respect, to provide us how they are meeting the compliance to these two documents. And you can see this is the KiboCube application form, but we have that embedded in the application forms that are relevant and are putting objects into space. For us, it's very important to understand how the applicants are understanding the international context, the guidelines, and how they are applying them to the project. The two documents have been commented already by my colleagues. You have the links there is also available in their presentations, where what I would like to do is to do a small dive into the documents so you can see some of the things that can be relevant when you are putting together an application form for access to space for all, that you need to flag and to be sure that you are compliant and you are expressing to us the compliance to that particular guideline and how you are building that compliance. So I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if you can see now the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines.
Yeah, we see it.
Perfect, that's good. So I was mentioning the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines is a set of guidelines. It's not that big. The implications are huge. They are very important for keeping space sustainable. And when a potential applicant for access to space for all is looking at this, that applicant will be able to see that there are guidelines that they can actually action, and there are guidelines that they cannot action depending on the type of opportunity that they are applying. I was presenting guideline number 7, which is talking about geostationary orbit. No, geosynchronous orbit, sorry, completely different. But it's talking about launch vehicles. And the applicants to access to space for all, they don't have a rocket. So they are not able, they are not able to actually control the orbital, the interference of the orbital stages of the launch vehicle. So that guideline is in that particular case is not applicable. So we are not asking to state compliance to that. Geosynchronous orbit, sorry, I got a little bit confused before. So geo orbit is an orbit that is very far. Normally the opportunities that we are providing are related to low Earth orbit. The opportunity that I was mentioning before, KiboCube, is deploying from the International Space Station. By deploying from the International Space Station, we are sure that the satellite is going to come down to the atmosphere of the sizes, I mean, considering the sizes of the satellites that are deployed through KiboCube in a couple of years, maximum. So that long-term interference, even if it would be applicable to low Earth orbit, I mean, in this particular case is geostationary orbit, would not be applicable because the satellites are, well, I mean, compliance will be easy to state because naturally, unless the satellites are pushed up, they are naturally decaying. There are things that definitely are applicable. For instance, minimize potential post-mission breakups resulting from stored energies. When a satellite is coming to an end of its lifetime, it has components that are storing energy, like batteries. It is very important to be sure that that energy is used, so the satellite is storing as minimum energy as possible, because otherwise there is the risk of an explosion or of a breakup. So in that particular case, this guideline is particularly relevant, and it has an impact on the end-of-life procedures of a small CubeSat, for instance. I mean, a good practice would be basically to be able to release all the energy from the battery and charge the battery, not allow the battery to continue to reload energy, and the satellite like that will have less stored energy. So those are guidelines that the applicants have to actually consider and to observe. And as I said, not all the guidelines are applicable. So please take into account your mission, confront it with the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines and see which ones are applicable and which are not. And when you are actually applying for an opportunity to access space for all, you have to explain to us why guideline number 1 is applicable, and if so, what are the steps that you are taking as an applicant to apply that guideline. And in the case that it's not applicable, you have to explain to us why you think it is not applicable. So that's considering the Space Debris Mitigation Guideline. That's very small, and I think the introduction that has been done by Tanya to the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities is actually leaving me not too much room for explaining. I mean, it was a great presentation and it contained all the information, but I want to draw attention to something that Tanya was saying at the end of her presentation. Consider the spirit of the guidelines. I mean, the guidelines, you will see when you are looking at the document that there is a lot of references to national and international organizations, a lot. But there are also references to non-governmental organizations, which in some cases can be applicants to access to space for all. And it actually made emphasis on the non-governmental entities. I'm probably going too fast because this was supposed to be in the preamble. So maybe I can go back to the preamble. So you see there, I mean, of course, Earth's orbit is a finite resource and is being used by not only by states or international organizations or intergovernmental organizations, but also by non-governmental entities. And that's why these guidelines are so important. That's why we are asking our applicants to actually go through the guidelines and find where they can actually contribute to their implementation. And there are examples. I mean, one example could be, for instance, 3C4 guideline, and I'm going to search for C4 or C. That is not going to work. So allow me for a second. Non-governmental. Missing an N there. Sorry for that. C2. You see, there are references all over the place concerning non-governmental entities. Some of those activities are to be encouraged by national governments, but there are others that are not. And you see here a very, very clear example. Non-governmental entities, including professional industry association and academic institutions, can play important roles in increasing international awareness of issues associated with the space sustainability. So we would like, when you are applying to access to space for all opportunity, to see how you are going to actually support the implementation of that particular guideline. And there are more examples inside the document, but as Tanya was mentioning before, I invite you to have a look at the document and to understand also the spirit of the document when you are putting together an application for access to space for all. So the key, I would say the key message is please read the documents. That's very important, these two documents. We are trying to simplify your work as much as possible. And as I mentioned before, Access to Space for All has 3 tracks that are aimed at developing a particular capability. But inside the tracks, there are different components. And we are putting together a tools component which contains open source tools that can help you in preparing your application. Actually, we have in the tools component under the web page, and I'm going to go to the web page so you see how it is structured. It's going to be easier. So if we start from the main page, I mean, you have an introduction to the initiative. You can go to, for instance, a satellite development track. And in the satellite development track, you have the 3 components there, the hands-on component. So it has the opportunities that we currently have under this track, which are KiboCube and Vega C. Actually, KiboCube is now open for applications. We have the education component with the different materials that we have been putting together to help the applicants to actually make good applications for those opportunities. And we are also working heavily on a tools component, as I said, open source tools that can be installed by anybody and can be used to actually make a better application. And in the list of the tools component and the satellite development track, you can find quite a few tools that are talking about space debris and risk estimation. Those are the tools. I mean, I would invite you, when you are putting together an application form for Access to Space for All, to have a look at those tools, whether you can benefit from those when you are stating the compliance to the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines and to the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, because those tools will give you very, very surely the technical way on how you are compliant, and you can justify your compliance by utilizing those tools. So I would encourage you to have a look at that also, at our webpage on Access to Space for All. And if you are planning to put together an application form, have a look at the tools component and the different tools that are available to actually help you on that task. The tool component is a work in progress, and we are actually working on it to extend the number of tools that are open source. We are actually compiling tools that are available. And normally they are made available by space agencies, supporting the access to space for all opportunities and putting together an application form. So have a look at our resources. They are there for that. When you are putting together an application form, go to the webpage of the track, because there you will find a wealth of resources on these topics. And this is not the Bible. I mean, there are other websites of the office. I was mentioning actually 2 documents that are put together, that have been put together by the office, and Tanya was mentioning the space sustainability project that the office has initiated with the support of some member states. So also have a look at those resources, because you can find some examples of how these guidelines are actioned in actually real life cases. And with that, I only have one extra thing to say. Please support us by using the hashtag #AgSpaceForAll that you have in the slide. If you are sharing information that has been created by the office under Access to Space for All, please use that hashtag. It helps us reach those people that may not know about the initiative but can potentially benefit of the initiative. And also I would like to invite you to join for the announcement of the awardees of one of the opportunities on the space exploration track, which was about provision of telescopes, that is starting in 35 minutes. And I'm sure that my colleagues will put the link in the chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jorge, for connecting the application form to the guidelines that were explained by Igor and Tanya. So we're running out of time, but we did have a few questions in the chat. So I'd like to give the floor back to Igor and Tanya, and maybe they can comment or they can answer some of the questions that have been asked. So maybe I'll start with you, Tanya, if you have any comments or if you have any answers that you can provide to some of the questions that were in the chat.
Sure, yes, I'm happy to. I see a couple of questions with similar themes about, the motivation of states to make national legislation that's in line with LTS guidance, and then also about, what's the extent of the applicability of the guidance. And I think to this, I would just say that we're seeing that most states, if not all, and also other actors like industry, they really want to be seen as good actors in space. They want to be thought leaders in space sustainability. So I think there's a strong motivation to pretty much all states members of the UN even, to really support this work. There has been, as we talked about, UN General Assembly recognition of this guidance. Although it's voluntary and not legally binding, as I mentioned earlier, it does have this really strong political legitimacy. In the preamble of the LTS guidelines, you even have a text that says the guidelines comprise commitments. So depending on how you interpret that also strengthens the legitimacy. this is all policy and not hard law, but it does speak to international cooperation and this ongoing desire to be seen as a good actor. And then I think there was also a question on how developing countries can contribute to legal frameworks. And generally, I would just say that engagement in the work of COPAS at subcommittees, in particular the legal subcommittee and the various working groups, that's a great place to start. I know the working group on the long-term sustainability has often called for more interventions from developing countries because it is clearly recognized that they have unique perspectives that are very valuable to the whole process. So while I don't think I will be getting into the details of ASAT testing or anything, the overall answers to these questions are there's a lot of motivation for states and industry and the private sector to play by the rules, even if they aren't hard law. And maybe I'll just leave it at that for the moment. And if Igor wants to compliment, please go ahead.
Thank you, Tanya. I think your response was very comprehensive, and I see some chats in some questions in the chat that probably are more suitable for space application section because they are specifically relating to how to fill out the forms. So probably in the interest of time, it's better to pass to Jorge.
I mean, I see one question. I'm starting from the bottom of the chat. Is it necessary to use all the tools components to ensure compliance with the guidelines? No, actually, you use the ones that you think are more applicable to you. We are trying to offer a wide selection that you can use, so feel free to pick up the ones that are more relevant to you. I would like to emphasize what has been said by my colleagues. I mean, the guidelines are being transposed to national regulations, and some of the tools that we have included in the tools component, they are actually talking about that transposition. And in particular, there is an ESA and an NASA tool that are talking about the European Space Agency Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines and NASA transposition also of those guidelines. So you have also to be careful and to see what applies to you. That's why I was referring to the guidelines, because it depends on the national legislation how those are cascading down to actually your particular case. But the tools are a very good starting point that you can actually see and play with. Let me see. Question, I was wondering if guidelines post-mission objects in GEO should be disposed to an orbitable GEO. How does this affect the future generation of the space? Well, I think Tanya was talking about remediation and mitigation. No, it was Igor talking about mitigation and remediation. And there are, I mean, the idea is that there is no interference in the operational orbits. Of course, there are discussions on how to actively remove debris, and there are discussions on actively removal within the committee. But I mean, the guideline, as stated today and agreed by consensus by the member states of the committee, actually states that, I mean, those objects have to be moved up to cause interference. And I don't know if there are more.
All the other questions have been covered by Tanya and Igor. So I think, yeah, we're good, and we have covered most of the questions. So again, thank you all for joining in today. I hope that the information that we provided really gave you a deeper understanding of the two important guidelines, and also especially to access to space for all applicants. We hope that this was helpful for you to fill in the application form. Right now, KiboCube, as Jorge was explaining, is open until the end of this month. And because it is a CubeSat that we will be launching, we will be really asking you for the compliance with these two guidelines. So again, as all of my three colleagues recommended, please read these guidelines carefully. And look at this webinar again if you get lost. And if there's any questions, please contact us here at UNOOSA, accesstospace@un.org. The presentations are already on the website, as my colleague Wenbin was putting it in the chat. The recordings of this webinar will be provided there and also on our YouTube channel, so please make sure to check that out. And also, lastly, please make sure to answer our questionnaire form before you leave. We would really love to hear your feedback because we would love to give you more interesting and more webinars that would give you more information. So please answer our questionnaire. And sorry, last but not least, as my colleague Jorge was explaining, from 2:30 Vienna time, which is in about 20 minutes or so, we will be having an announcement of the awardees of the ISON-Scope opportunity, and it is our first round winners. So we hope that all of you can join us and see this, witness this moment with us. So again, thank you all for joining in. Thank you, Aigo. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Jorge, for your presentations. And yes, we hope to see you soon. And please make sure to help us promote this webinar through social media and through your emails and your connections. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice day. Bye.